When the war swept across North Africa, thousands of German soldiers believed capture by the Allies meant certain humiliation, maybe even death. Nazi propaganda had painted America as a weak, chaotic land run by greedy businessmen and lazy soldiers. The idea that the United States could feed its own people, let alone enemy prisoners, was unthinkable. But in the summer of 1943, as transport ships carrying German prisoners crossed the Atlantic, those beliefs began to crack. The prisoners expected the journey to be miserable, cramped quarters, starvation, and harsh guards. Instead, they found order, discipline, and something stranger: kindness. The moment the ships docked at American ports like Norfolk, Virginia, disbelief turned into shock. They stepped onto soil that felt like another world. Everything seemed enormous: the cranes, the ships, the endless lines of trucks and trains loading supplies. This was the industrial machine they had only heard rumors about, but now they were seeing it, alive and unstoppable. Instead of insults or beatings, the guards offered calm directions. Some even smiled. The prisoners were given clean uniforms, medical checkups, and, to their utter confusion, full meals. For men who had been living on thin soup and dry bread, the trays loaded with meat, potatoes, and milk looked unreal. And then came the biggest surprise of all: a cold bottle of Coca-Cola fizzing in the sunlight. Many POWs refused to drink it at first. They thought it was some kind of trick or experiment. But when one brave soldier took a sip and felt the sweet, sharp taste of carbonation, laughter rippled through the group. "This is what the Americans drink?" one man whispered, half in disbelief, half in envy. Their arrival didn't feel like punishment. It felt like waking up in a strange dream. The enemy they'd been taught to hate didn't look cruel or desperate. Instead, they were surrounded by abundance and food, machines, and smiles everywhere. For the first time, many of them wondered, had we been lied to? What awaited them in the coming months would challenge not only their loyalty, but their entire understanding of power, humanity, and what it meant to truly live in freedom. For the German prisoners, the first morning in the American camp felt unreal. Back in Europe, soldiers had learned to live with hunger. In North Africa, they had fought under a scorching sun, eating crusts of bread and drinking dirty water. Now in the land of their enemy, they woke to the smell of pancakes, sizzling bacon, and freshly brewed coffee. As they stood in line for breakfast, the disbelief only deepened. The mess hall gleamed with stainless steel counters and electric lights. Behind them, American cooks joked and sang as they served trays stacked high with scrambled eggs, syrup, butter, fruit, and milk. To men who had survived on rations smaller than a child's meal, it was overwhelming. One prisoner, Hans Richter, later recalled, "We were sure it was some kind of show, that the Red Cross was watching, so they wanted to impress us. But it never stopped. The food never ran out. Then came another symbol of American abundance, Coca-Cola. In Germany, it was a luxury product, often reserved for officers. But here, bottles of Coke were sold in camp canteens for 5 cents, the same price American civilians paid. To the prisoners, this was unthinkable. Even the enemy's prisoners could afford what German citizens could not. They were also introduced to something even rarer: ice cream. Sweet, cold, and creamy at Hermanos, it felt almost magical. In the middle of war, when Europe was starving and cities lay in ruins, these men were eating ice cream served by their captors. Many POWs couldn't stop talking about it. Letters home, carefully censored, of course, mentioned the food again and again. "We eat better here than we did as soldiers," one wrote. Another joked, "If this is prison, I never want to be free." But it wasn't just about the meals. Every meal was a statement, a quiet display of power. The prisoners began to understand that America's strength didn't come from cruelty or conquest, but from production, from factories that could feed millions, from farms that never stopped working, and from a belief that abundance was a kind of freedom. Even the guards treated them differently. American soldiers didn't mock or insult the POWs. They enforced rules but without hate. Some even shared cigarettes or played cards after duty hours. That small humanity, a smile, a shared joke, began to erode years of Nazi propaganda. Soon the prisoners started working in the camps, cleaning, cooking, helping with maintenance. For every task, they earned a few cents a day, which they could spend at the camp store. There they found shelves stocked with candy bars, soap, cigarettes, postcards, and yes, Coca-Cola and ice cream. It was as if the United States was saying, "This is what we can afford to give even our enemies." The Germans had been taught that America was weak, divided, and corrupt. But now they saw an entirely different truth. A nation that could build endlessly, feed endlessly, and smile while doing it. At night in the barracks, the men would whisper among themselves. If the Americans can do this in war, one asked, what will they do in peace? The question lingered long after the lights went out. Because in that camp, surrounded by laughter, food, and the hum of distant machinery, many began to realize that the real weapon of the United States wasn't its guns or bombs. It was its abundance. After a few days in holding facilities near the coast, the German prisoners were herded once again onto transport vehicles, not cattle cars or trucks as they feared, but passenger trains. The guards told them they were being transferred to permanent camps, scattered across the heartland of the United States. None of them realized it then, but the next few days would change everything they thought they knew about America. The train cars were clean and comfortable, with cushioned seats and windows that stretched wide to reveal a land that seemed to have no end. The soldiers pressed their faces against the glass, silent at first. Then the whispering began. Fields, forests, rivers, cities. The scenery changed by the hour, and yet it all looked thriving, alive, untouched by war. Back home, Europe was scarred. Bombed railways, empty towns, hungry civilians. But here smoke rose not from destruction, but from factories. Every town seemed to hum with production. In one stopover, an American guard shared his newspaper with a POW who could read English. The front page wasn't about shortages or suffering. It was about baseball scores, new factory openings, and a new kind of airplane rolling off assembly lines. The German soldier looked up and muttered almost to himself, "They are not suffering at all." Even the meals during the journey stunned them. In the dining car they were served fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and coffee. Real coffee, not the bitter substitute they drank back home. For dessert, pie and unbelievably ice cream. To the Americans on board, it was nothing special. But to the prisoners, it was a glimpse into another world. As the train moved deeper inland, through vast farmlands and sprawling cities, one thing became clear. This country was enormous and everything in it was working. The men who had once believed that the war was turning in Germany's favor now sat in uneasy silence. How could they ever defeat a nation that could build this much, feed this much, and still have room to spare? When they finally reached their destination, one of the large camps in states like Iowa, Texas, or Tennessee, they were met not by harsh military prisons, but by orderly compounds surrounded by fences. There were barracks with electricity and heat, clean water, and even libraries. Some camps had small theaters where American films were screened, though the content was carefully chosen. One POW later said, "When I saw the camp, I understood that the war was already lost. A nation that can treat its enemies this well does not fear defeat." But the journey across America did more than just humble them. It opened their eyes to scale. They passed endless lines of Liberty ships under construction, each capable of carrying supplies across the Atlantic. They saw factories turning out tanks, trucks, and aircraft faster than the German military could destroy them. They noticed something else too, the diversity of the workers. Black, white immigrant women, all working side by side. For men who came from a rigid, racially stratified society, it was another shock. In Germany, one POW later wrote, "We were told America was divided by chaos, but we saw strength in their differences." At night, as the train clattered through the darkness, conversations turned inward. Some spoke of home, of wives and children under the bombs. Others sat quietly, staring into the window's reflection, seeing not their faces, but the vast machine that was America. By the time they reached their final camps, many of the prisoners no longer thought of the United States as an enemy. They thought of it as a mystery, one they couldn't quite understand but deeply respected. They had come expecting a land of weakness and corruption. Instead, they found a country so vast and industrious that even its prisoners lived in comfort. That realization would stay with them, not as fear, but as awe. For the first time, they began to wonder, if this is how America treats its enemies, how do they treat their own people? The answer would come soon, inside the camps themselves, where the daily rhythm of American life would continue to surprise, challenge, and transform them in ways they never expected. When the German prisoners arrived at their final destinations, the first thing that struck them was the calm. There was no shouting, no barking of orders, no fear. American guards moved with quiet efficiency, speaking in measured tones rather than screams. The camps themselves, built quickly yet methodically, resembled small towns more than prisons. Each compound was surrounded by barbed wire. Yes, but inside the fences stood neat rows of wooden barracks, washrooms with running water, electricity, and even hot showers. There were mess halls, workshops, and recreation areas. For men expecting hunger and brutality, it was another shock. At Crossville in Tennessee, at Camp Swift in Texas, and dozens of other locations scattered across the American heartland, life for the German POWs settled into a steady rhythm, a routine that felt almost normal. Every morning began with roll call, followed by breakfast. The food remained generous: eggs, bacon, coffee, bread with butter or jam. Many couldn't believe that such meals were served daily to prisoners. Some secretly feared that it was temporary, that one day the generosity would end. But it didn't. Week after week, the meals remained abundant. Soon, they discovered the camp canteens, known as PX stores. Inside were shelves lined with soap, toothpaste, razors, candy bars, cigarettes, tobacco, postcards, and, astonishingly, Coca-Cola. The same Coke bottles they'd seen American soldiers drink were now available to them at the same price. The POWs earned small wages for their work, around 80 cents a day, which they could use to buy these items. For many, that was more than they'd ever had as soldiers. They would line up, coins in hand, for bottles of Coke or cartons of ice cream. The hum of conversation in those lines often turned to laughter, something that had been missing from their lives for years. One former prisoner recalled, "It felt impossible. We were enemies, yet they treated us like men, even customers." Beyond food and comfort, there was another kind of freedom inside the fences: freedom of thought. The camps allowed reading, art, and even education. Many prisoners joined classes in English, mathematics, or history, often taught by fellow POWs or American volunteers. Libraries stocked with donated books became gathering points, where men read about American democracy, industry, and culture. Slowly, curiosity began to replace hostility. They had been taught that Americans were lazy, immoral, and incapable of discipline. But here they saw guards who were courteous yet firm, who joked with them yet followed rules. They saw efficiency and fairness, things that the Nazi regime claimed only it could provide. During off hours, they played soccer, built furniture, painted murals, and held music nights. The American guards sometimes joined in, friendly competitions that erased for a moment the lines between prisoner and jailer. One guard at Camp McCain wrote home, "They're not monsters. They're just men, tired, polite, and very surprised by us." The POWs also noticed something they could never have imagined in Germany: racial integration within the American army camps. Though the US was still far from equality, they saw black soldiers, Mexican workers, and white officers all functioning within the same system. The Germans, raised in a culture of racial hierarchy, didn't know what to make of it. Some were confused, others were quietly impressed. Work assignments became another window into America's might. The prisoners were sent to farms, sawmills, and factories, not as slaves but as paid laborers. They picked fruit, harvested cotton, and repaired fences. At first they worked cautiously, waiting for mistreatment. Instead, they were offered coffee breaks, shade, and conversation. Many American farmers later said that the German workers were among the best they'd ever had. For the prisoners, each day on those farms was an education. They saw tractors plowing fields wider than entire villages back home. They saw machinery doing the work of hundreds of men. And when they were paid for their labor and handed a cold Coke at the end of the day, they began to feel something unexpected: respect. Inside the camps, news of the war filtered in slowly. Radio broadcasts and American newspapers painted a picture very different from the propaganda they'd grown up with. The Allies were advancing. German cities were burning. And yet here they were, safe, fed and treated with dignity by the very people they'd been told were savages. Some prisoners struggled with guilt. Others felt relief. Most felt confusion. At night, after lights out, quiet conversations filled the barracks. "How can they do this?" one man whispered. "Feed their enemies like this in wartime." Another replied softly, "Because they can afford to." That answer said everything. America's greatest weapon wasn't its tanks or planes. It was the sheer weight of its abundance, the ability to be generous even in war. By the end of that first winter, the shock had worn off, replaced by something deeper: admiration. The prisoners began to write in their diaries, not just about the food or comfort, but about the idea of America, the strange, open, confident spirit that seemed to flow through everything. Inside the barbed wire behind enemy lines, German soldiers were quietly falling under the influence of something stronger than any propaganda. The simple power of freedom lived, not preached. As autumn faded into winter, the POW camps across America took on a strange, almost festive atmosphere. The air grew cold, and frost glimmered on the fences each morning. For many German prisoners, it was their first Christmas away from home, away from the front lines, away from fear. But they never expected that even as captives, they would experience something that felt like peace and kindness. The first hint came a few weeks before Christmas. American guards began stringing up lights around the camp headquarters. Trees were brought in, decorated with paper chains and tinsel. The prisoners watched silently from behind the fences, confused. Surely this celebration wasn't meant for them. But as the days passed, it became clear. Each camp was given permission to hold its own Christmas services. Prayer choirs sang carols in German. Guards attended quietly, hats in hand. The mess halls were decorated with wreaths and tables filled with roast turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and apple pie. Every man received extra rations, cigarettes, and candy, all at government expense. Then came something no one had imagined: gifts from local Americans, church groups, women's clubs, and even school children from nearby towns organized drives to send presents into the camps: handmade scarves, knitted gloves, postcards, small boxes of candy, even letters that simply said, "Merry Christmas, whoever you are." To men who had been taught that Americans were cruel barbarians, this kindness was disarming. Some prisoners refused to take the gifts at first, thinking it was a trick. But when they realized it was genuine, many were brought to tears. One former POW later recalled, "That Christmas I began to see the Americans not as enemies, but as human beings." The guards, too, softened during the holidays. Rules relaxed, music filled the air, and some even joined the Germans for shared carols. There were small soccer matches, shared meals, and laughter. For a few hours, the war outside the fences felt distant, replaced by something universal and simple: humanity. For many of the prisoners, it was the first time they had seen compassion without a motive. The Nazi regime had taught them that kindness was weakness, that mercy was for fools. Yet here in a foreign land, their captors showed kindness not out of fear but out of strength. It was a revelation that struck deeper than any weapon could. One of the most touching moments came at Camp Hearn, Texas. A group of American children had drawn pictures of Christmas trees and snowmen to send to the prisoners. One picture carried a message written in shaky handwriting: "Dear German soldier, I hope you get to go home soon. God loves you too." That small note passed from hand to hand inside the barracks. Some kissed it. Others tucked it into their journals. For many, it was the first time they had felt seen, not as soldiers, not as enemies, but as men. After the holidays, life in the camps continued. But something had changed. The POWs began to smile more, talk more openly, and show respect to the guards. A quiet mutual understanding developed. Many started learning English more seriously, writing down new words, asking questions about American life, about freedom, about how a country so big could remain so organized. In the workshops, they built toys, carved wooden figurines, and made greeting cards for the American children who had written to them. One camp even organized a thank you play, a small German language performance dedicated to the kindness of the locals. When the townspeople were invited to watch, they came in large numbers. There was applause, laughter, counted for a brief moment. No sides, no uniforms, no enemy lines. The more they interacted with ordinary Americans, the more the POWs began to understand the real source of America's strength. It wasn't just its factories or food, it was its people. A nation confident enough to be kind. A society secure enough to show mercy. Letters written during this time reveal a profound shift in tone. Gone was the arrogance of soldiers who once believed in German superiority. In its place was admiration, even humility. One man wrote to his wife, "If Germany had the heart of America, there would be no war." For many prisoners, the kindness they experienced during those holidays became a turning point. They began questioning everything they'd been taught about strength, loyalty, and obedience. The propaganda that had filled their youth crumbled when faced with the simple reality of American generosity. It wasn't just the abundance of food or gifts, it was the sense of fairness that surrounded them. Guards treated them like humans, farmers trusted them to work in their fields, and civilians sent them good wishes, even while their own sons fought overseas. By the spring of 1944, the POWs had settled fully into camp life. Many no longer saw the fences as barriers, but as temporary boundaries in a world that suddenly seemed full of possibility. They read books about democracy, listened to American music, and talked about what life might be like when the war ended. When Easter arrived, more gifts came: painted eggs, chocolate, and cards. Some of the German men, moved by the generosity, volunteered to help local communities with farming and repairs. They wanted to give something back. That desire to repay kindness with effort marked a profound transformation. America hadn't re-educated them with force or fear. It had simply shown them another way to live. Years later, when many of these men returned to Germany, they would speak of those holidays as the moment their hearts began to change. Not because they were defeated, but because they were treated with dignity, as one former POW later said in an interview. In the camps, America taught us something our own leaders never could, that true power is not how much you can take, but how much you can give. And in that season of warmth, generosity and laughter shared between enemies. America's quiet victory began, not on the battlefield, but in the hearts of the men who once fought against it. By 1944, the German prisoners had settled into their new lives in America. The war raged across Europe, but behind the fences of the US prison camps, a quieter revolution was taking place, one that would reshape their beliefs forever. After months of comfort, food, and surprising kindness, the US Army began assigning thousands of POWs to labor projects. At first, the men were suspicious. They expected hard, humiliating work, something that would remind them they were still captives. But what awaited them outside the fences was not punishment. It was education in disguise. The United States faced a growing labor shortage. Millions of American men were fighting overseas, leaving factories, farms, and food plants desperate for hands. So the War Department made an unusual decision. They allowed German prisoners to work in American industries under guard for fair wages. The first assignments were in agriculture. POWs were sent to the vast farmlands of the Midwest and South, rows upon rows of corn, wheat, sugar beets, and cotton that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. To men who had come from a war-torn Europe of rationing and scarcity, these landscapes looked impossible. They couldn't believe the sheer scale. One German soldier, who had worked as a farmer before the war, stood silent for minutes, staring at a single American wheat field and whispering, "This one farm grows more than our entire village." And then came the machinery, tractors, combines and irrigation systems, larger and more powerful than anything they had seen in Germany. Machines that could plow, harvest, and process in hours what had taken days or weeks by hand. Some of the men even requested to ride on the combines, watching in amazement as metal giants turned fields into golden seas of grain. The farmers who supervised them treated them firmly but fairly. There were no beatings, no cruelty, only work, food, and respect for a job well done. Lunch breaks were generous, and the men were often given sandwiches, fruit, and cold drinks. Occasionally, a farmer's wife would bring out a jug of lemonade or even a plate of cookies, small gestures that left lasting impressions. As one POW later recalled, "It was impossible to keep hating people who shared their food with you while your own country told you they were monsters." Those assigned to factories were even more stunned. The prisoners expected noise and chaos, but what they found was precision. Enormous assembly lines running like clockwork, each worker performing a single task in perfect rhythm. They watched in awe as cars, tractors, and aircraft parts moved steadily down conveyor belts, every motion measured, every part interchangeable. This was not the rigid, top-down control of the German war machine. This was organized freedom, a system where even ordinary workers had power and pride. At one automobile plant, a German engineer turned prisoner quietly said to his guard, "In Germany, this many men could not produce this much without whips and fear." The guard simply smiled. "Here we use paychecks and Coca-Cola instead." The prisoners laughed, but the truth stung. They began to realize what American power truly meant. Not just machines, but a system that made people want to work. Some of the POWs were mechanics or craftsmen. They were allowed to assist in maintenance, giving them a closer look at American tools, materials, and efficiency. What shocked them most was the abundance. Every tool neatly stored, every spare part available, every factory stocked with more raw material than an entire German town might see in a year. In one Texas food processing plant, prisoners watched tons of fruit being canned daily. Rows of workers sorted peaches and cherries while conveyor belts hummed. The German men couldn't believe that so much food was being packed. Not for elites, not for soldiers, but for ordinary civilians. They had been raised to believe that only the strong deserved plenty. Here, even children and workers enjoyed abundance. The German officers among the prisoners began to take notes, quietly, methodically. They studied how the Americans did it. How could a single farm or factory produce so much, move it so efficiently, and distribute it nationwide without chaos? The answer, they soon realized, wasn't just machinery. It was the system itself. America's economy was decentralized but coordinated. Thousands of private companies working together through contracts, logistics, and trust. Standardized systems made everything compatible. From Coca-Cola bottling plants to army mess halls, the same rules, tools, and recipes applied everywhere. In a POW's words, "We thought America was disorderly. Instead, we found order through freedom." When some of the prisoners were allowed to see rail yards and ports, the scale grew even more unbelievable. Train cars filled with grain, coal, and machinery stretched for miles. At docks, Liberty ships, those massive cargo vessels, were being loaded around the clock. Guards told them that a new Liberty ship could be built in just 42 hours. The men thought it was a joke, until they saw the newspaper articles proving it. To them, it was as if America had industrialized the very concept of abundance. One of the most shocking experiences for German POWs was how casually Americans treated resources. In the camps, they had already seen cooks throw away leftover food, broken equipment replaced rather than repaired, and ice used in drinks even during wartime. Now, outside the camps, they saw it on a national scale. Factories rejected entire batches of canned fruit for being slightly imperfect. Farmers discarded crops that didn't meet visual standards. Grocery stores stocked candy, gum, and soda, as if sugar were limitless. To men from a country where people scraped flour from empty sacks and boiled potato peels for soup, this casual waste was unthinkable, and strangely awe-inspiring. It wasn't arrogance, it was confidence. As one POW later said, America was so rich it could afford mistakes, and that realization hit harder than any lecture on democracy. A system that could throw away sugar during wartime, yet still have enough to feed prisoners and send food to Europe, was beyond anything the German mind could reconcile. The psychological shift was undeniable. At first, the POWs had looked down on American materialism. They called it lazy, unrefined, lacking discipline. But as they saw how that same comfort fueled productivity and innovation, they began to respect it deeply. One evening, while resting after work, a group of prisoners debated what truly made America strong. Was it its land? Its factories? Its wealth? A quiet soldier, formerly a teacher, said, "No, it's because they believe everyone deserves to share in it." That simple statement silenced the group. It was something none of them had ever heard in Germany. In Nazi Germany, privilege belonged to the few, the pure, the chosen. In America, even the lowest worker could drink Coca-Cola, eat ice cream, and read the same newspaper as a general. This was equality through abundance, and it fascinated them. The prisoners were allowed to send letters through the Red Cross, though censored. But even the censored ones carried glimpses of revelation. A captured officer wrote, "My dear wife, they give us 3 meals a day, and we eat better than at home." The Americans are strange, generous to their enemies. It makes one wonder who the real barbarians are. Another wrote to his son, "Here every man has work. Every machine runs. Every child drinks milk. Remember this when you grow up. Power is not in shouting, but in building. These words, carried across the ocean to a starving Germany, became seeds of change. By the end of 1944, many POWs had stopped seeing themselves as defeated soldiers and started to see themselves as students of a new kind of civilization. They had witnessed not just American might, but American purpose. They saw that a nation could fight a world war, feed its population, and still have enough to give candy to its enemies. And as they lay in their bunks at night, the echoes of machinery from nearby factories hummed like a lullaby, the sound of a society not just surviving, but thriving. For these men, it was no longer just about food or comfort. It was about understanding that freedom itself was a form of power, and for the first time, they began to hope, not for Germany's victory, but for Germany's transformation. By early 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its final devastating months. News of bombed German cities, food shortages, and chaos trickled into American prison camps through censored letters and whispered rumors. The men behind the barbed wire, German POWs who had once marched proudly under the Nazi flag, began to see their homeland not as a mighty empire, but as a place sinking under its own delusions. Inside the camps, life continued with an almost unsettling normalcy. The prisoners woke to breakfast, eggs, toast, and sometimes even bacon. They worked in the fields or factories, earning small wages redeemable at the camp canteen. They played soccer on weekends, built furniture, painted murals, and sang songs from home. And every week the Red Cross brought mail from Europe. Letters written in trembling handwriting, some barely legible, often smudged with tears. One young soldier, barely 20, opened a letter from his mother. "We have no potatoes left. Your sister trades her shoes for bread. The neighbors boil grass and bark for soup. If only the Führer would end this madness." He folded the paper and stared silently at his plate of hot stew and fresh bread. Around him, others did the same. The room filled with a heavy stillness. In that moment, the Coca-Cola and ice cream didn't taste sweet anymore. They tasted like guilt. The US government, recognizing the humane treatment of POWs, began allowing prisoners to send small packages or money through the Red Cross back to Germany. For many, it was the only way to help their starving families. They pooled their wages, nickels and dimes earned from labor, and used them to send care parcels, tins of food, chocolate, and soap. Even those who had nothing left of their own shared what they could. One camp in Kansas raised enough money to send hundreds of dollars worth of supplies back to German civilians. The guards, moved by their compassion, helped organize shipments. Ironically, the prisoners, supposedly enemies of the United States, were now becoming channels of American generosity to their own people. A POW named Carl later wrote, "It was the first time I felt truly human since the war began. To help, not to destroy, that was the real victory." As the months passed, discussions among the prisoners grew deeper. They no longer argued about Hitler or victory. Instead, they debated what kind of Germany could exist after defeat. Inside the camp's libraries were stocked with books, German classics, English novels, and even American history texts. Some prisoners, hungry for understanding, began reading about democracy, freedom, and capitalism, the very ideas they had been taught to despise. For the first time, they could compare propaganda with lived experience. How could a supposedly decadent nation be so organized? How could weak democracies produce such strong unity and wealth? One camp commandant, a thoughtful US officer fluent in German, encouraged open debate sessions. He told the men, "You cannot rebuild Germany with hate. You must rebuild it with truth." At first, many refused to listen. But curiosity soon overcame pride. They listened to American radio broadcasts, heard swing music, and learned about the Bill of Rights. They saw black American soldiers guarding them, something that shocked them deeply. The idea that a country could be led and defended by people of all races was inconceivable in Nazi Germany. At first, they whispered racist remarks. But over time, as they saw these soldiers treat them fairly, even kindly, their prejudices began to crumble. As one POW admitted years later, "The first time a black guard shared his cigarette with me, I realized everything Hitler told us was a lie. By 1945, America had transformed its prison camps into what some historians now call classrooms of democracy. Prisoners could attend lectures on world history, economics, and literature. Some learned English, others took up carpentry or mechanics. A few even studied American law and governance. In one Texas camp, a group of POWs wrote and performed a play titled The Broken Swastika. It told the story of a soldier who discovers that loyalty to an evil system destroys not his enemies, but his own soul. The American officers watched the performance with quiet pride. It meant the message was getting through. Many POWs began keeping journals, documenting their transformation. One wrote, "I came here believing America was a land of greed. I leave believing it is a land of fairness. They have conquered not just our armies, but our hearts." Then in May 1945, word arrived, Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. The Reich had fallen. The news hit like an earthquake. Some prisoners wept, others sat in stunned silence. A few fanatics raged, shouting that the reports were lies. But even they knew deep down that the world they fought for was gone. For many, the question became, what now? There was no home to return to, only ruins. Their families were hungry, their cities ashes. And yet, within the wire fences of an enemy land, they had found something they'd never had in Germany: dignity. Some requested to stay longer. They feared what awaited them back home, not Allied retribution, but the emptiness of defeat. The Americans, bound by international law, began preparing their repatriation. But they did something few expected. They sent the men home with clothes, food rations, and letters of recommendation for future work. It was not victory with vengeance, it was victory with grace. As they boarded the ships back to Europe, many looked around in silence one last time. The docks were alive with activity, trains unloading, cranes lifting steel, ships gliding into the harbor. America's machine of production kept moving, tireless, unstoppable. Some smiled, others swallowed hard. One prisoner murmured, "We lost the war because we tried to destroy what these people built." On the deck, they saw guards drinking Coca-Cola, laughing and waving goodbye. It felt surreal. These same men had captured them and yet treated them as equals in humanity. The hum of engines and the sight of American industry stretching into the distance left a final impression. A nation that had turned freedom into fuel. When the ships finally sailed toward the Atlantic, the German POWs knew they were leaving more than a prison. They were leaving a lesson. They had seen firsthand that power built on cruelty collapses, but power built on fairness endures. And for the rest of their lives, many of them would tell their children and grandchildren about the strange land where the enemy gave them ice cream, Coca-Cola, and, without realizing it, a new way to see the world. When the German prisoners finally stepped off the ships back onto European soil, the war was over, but the world they had known was gone. Cities lay in ruins. Streets once filled with marching boots were now silent, covered in rubble and dust. The men who had been captured years earlier returned not to victory parades, but to hunger, homelessness, and humiliation. Yet, as they walked through the shattered remains of their homeland, many carried something far more powerful than anger or despair. They carried perspective. The people who greeted them at home were ghosts of their former selves, thin, hollow-eyed, clutching ration cards and waiting in endless food lines. Children scavenged through ruins for firewood. Entire towns had vanished under the weight of Allied bombs. The returning POWs brought stories that no one wanted to believe at first, stories of American abundance, decency, and mercy. They spoke of clean camps, warm meals, fair treatment, and even laughter. They described guards who shared cigarettes and farmers who offered lemonade. They told their families about Coca-Cola, jukeboxes, and how even factory workers in America could afford shoes, meat, and radios. At first, their words sounded like fantasy. Some Germans accused them of being brainwashed by enemy propaganda. But as more and more POWs returned with the same stories, the truth became undeniable. They hadn't been converted by speeches. They had been transformed by kindness. As one returning soldier wrote in his diary, "We went to America as Nazis. We came back as men." In post-war Germany, chaos reigned. The Allied occupation forces worked to rebuild the country, but they also faced a monumental challenge: reshaping its mindset. They needed Germans to believe in democracy, not dictatorship. Unknowingly, the returning POWs became some of the most effective teachers. They had seen a system where power served the people, not the other way around. They knew what freedom looked like, not as an abstract idea but as daily life. These former prisoners began spreading what they had learned. They told village councils, schools and churches about how America functioned, about civic duty, cooperation and opportunity. They spoke of a land where even prisoners were treated with respect. One former sergeant, who later became a school teacher, introduced American-style classroom discussions to his students, open debates, critical thinking, questions without fear. Another became a mayor and implemented transparent local governance, saying we must never again be ruled by silence. Without realizing it, the German POWs who had been sent to work in American farms and factories became the moral architects of a new, democratic Germany. In the years that followed, many of them continued writing to their American guards, farmers and camp commanders. Some even received packages, letters, photos and small gifts. Friendships born behind barbed wire survived long after peace returned. One farmer from Nebraska received a Christmas card from a former German POW every year until his death. It always carried the same message: "You showed me how humanity can exist even in war. I will never forget." These quiet exchanges built invisible bridges across the Atlantic, bridges made not of politics or treaties, but of personal respect. For the Americans, it was a testament to what they believed in, that decency, even toward an enemy, could change hearts more than bullets ever could. Years later, when West Germany began to rebuild into a thriving democracy, journalists often asked what inspired its rapid recovery. Economists pointed to the Marshall Plan, the billions of dollars in aid from the United States. But sociologists pointed to something deeper: the human experience that thousands of German POWs had brought home. They had tasted American life, literally and figuratively. The ice cream and Coca-Cola that had once seemed like symbols of enemy indulgence had become symbols of freedom, creativity, and possibility. To them, America's greatness wasn't just its machines or factories, it was its belief that every individual mattered. That simple truth became a moral compass for many who helped rebuild Germany from ashes into prosperity, as one ex-POW turned engineer recalled decades later. When I designed my first factory in Hamburg, I thought of what I saw in Texas: order, safety, efficiency, and respect for every worker. I built it the American way. By the 1950s, Germany had changed beyond recognition. Streets buzzed again with laughter, schools reopened, and factories hummed with new purpose. Democracy had taken root, not through occupation but through inspiration. Historians now call it re-education through experience. America hadn't just defeated Germany's army, it had defeated its ideology. And it did so not with propaganda but with humanity. The POWs, once symbols of defeat, became messengers of renewal. Their time in American camps had planted seeds that would grow into the foundations of modern Germany: tolerance, democracy, and dignity. And perhaps the greatest irony of all, the men who once swore allegiance to Hitler became among the strongest defenders of democratic values in the decades that followed. Years later, at a reunion of former POWs, an old soldier stood up and shared his memory. "I remember sitting under a tree in a camp in Louisiana. It was hot. A guard brought me ice cream. I laughed. Ice cream in war. He said, in America, even prisoners deserve a good day. I never forgot that, because that day I realized freedom is not about who wins. It's about who remembers to care." The room was silent. Then applause broke out, quiet at first, then growing stronger. The war had ended long ago, but the lessons endured. For these men, the true shock had never been defeat. It was discovering that compassion could be more powerful than conquest. And in the memory of every POW who had tasted kindness in a foreign land, America's real victory lived on, not as a nation that conquered enemies, but as one that conquered hate,